I was erased from the family yacht trip. Not declined, not overlooked. Erased like chalk wiped clean from a slate like a name deliberately rubbed from a ledger. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight, and it wasn't quiet either, though they wanted it to look that way. The list went out the manifest, circulated the invitations, posted in glossy loops on Instagram, and my name was nowhere. They didn't leave a blank space where I should have been, they filled it. They replaced me with a yoga instructor, a stranger stretching into warrior poses on teak deck boards that should have been under my feet arms, raised like some symbol of balance, while my absence was painted over with captions about family tradition. I scrolled through their stories with a still face, but inside the ground tilted. You tell yourself it's a glitch, a clerical slip, something that will be explained when you call, but deep down you know names don't vanish without hands erasing them. I watched Celine record it, her champagne tilted just so her pearls gleaming at her collarbone as she angled the phone toward the woman lunging in designer leggings. The caption spun across the screen, new ritual, same legacy. I almost laughed at the neatness of it. They had curated my erasure. They wanted strangers to see an unbroken picture, a family bound together, loyal, glowing in soft Mediterranean light. But my seat wasn't empty. It was staged. The camera lingered on the spot where I should have been filled now with a body they hired, a performance they wanted to pass as permanence. That morning, the kitchen sunlight was thin and brittle. My coffee sat untouched, its steam dissolving into air as if it couldn't bear to stay. Every object felt complicit. The spoon resting crooked on the counter, the chair I hadn't pulled out, the silence that stretched too long between the clock ticks. I kept refreshing my phone as if that might summon my name back onto the manifest. It didn't. Instead, what arrived was confirmation, clean, clinical, cruel. My cancellation had gone through. Not forgotten. Confirmed. My replacement had already been tagged, hashtagged, toasted. And then came the shift. Not in their posts, not in their voices, but in the air the moment I set foot on the dock. The wood planks creaked under me, the salt wind rushed across my face, and the yacht rose up gleaming and indifferent as ever. The water slapped against its hull like a gavel, falling again and again. I walked steady, each step measured my heels, clicking in time with my heartbeat. Behind the glass windows of the upper deck, I caught glimpses Celine's silhouette leaning into Victor's Odessa's pearls, catching the last of the sunlight. Dorian's head turned deliberately away. They thought the stage was sealed. They thought the performance was airtight. Maris Calder, the crew leader, stepped forward. Her expression was unreadable. Her professionalism polished smooth from years at sea, but her words sliced the air with the precision of a verdict. "Welcome aboard," she said. Her eyes locked on mine, steady, unwavering. "Welcome aboard. The owner." The pause hung like thunder. Owner. The word detonated behind me. Glasses froze midway to lips. Champagne trembled, caught in the rim of crystal. Odessa's hand stilled on her pearls, fingers tightening until the strand strained. Celine's smile cracked small and sharp fissures running through the mask she had worn all evening. Victor glanced sideways, waiting for her cue, but no cue came. Dorian looked anywhere but at me, his silence collapsing into something heavier than guilt. One word had undone them. Owner, not influencer, not guest, not silent partner, owner. They could erase my name from a list, but they couldn't erase it from the deed. Ownership isn't a caption you can crop or a hashtag you can rewrite. It doesn't vanish because someone curates a prettier picture. It sits under everything, carved into ledgers too deep for performance to reach. I stood there on the deck, the air taut, the silence louder than the sea around us. In that moment, I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to hold up paper or wave receipts. The truth had spoken for me, uninvited, undeniable. Their toast shattered. Their ritual broke. Their legacy fractured. All it took was a greeting. "Welcome aboard, the owner." And with that, the story they had been building collapsed and mine began. That morning looked painfully ordinary, the kind of morning I had once clung to as proof that life could be steady. The kitchen glowed with September sunlight, soft and golden as it spilled across the tiles, catching on the edges of stacked plates, glinting off the rim of my coffee mug. Steam rose from the cup in thin curls, curling and dissolving in the air like a fragile promise of peace. The espresso machine had already hissed its last breath, leaving behind the faint hum of the refrigerator and the measured tick of the clock above the sink. I sat barefoot at the table, my skin chilled by the cool floor, my hands wrapped tightly around the mug's warmth, believing for just one suspended moment that the day might stay quiet, that it might stay safe. The table held only the bare essentials, the mug, my phone, a folded napkin, waiting unused. The kind of still life no one photographs because it lacks sparkle, because it doesn't sell belonging or legacy. But to me, in that fleeting pause, it felt whole. I let the silence stretch, let the morning carry its own rhythm. I thought about leaving my phone untouched, about protecting the illusion for a few more minutes. To keep the quiet intact was to keep myself intact. But habit is stronger than intention, and my hand moved before my resolve could catch up. My thumb slid across the glass, and the screen blinked awake, spilling light into the fragile stillness. Notifications stacked themselves in neat rows, demanding to be seen. I scrolled without thought, reels looping endlessly, champagne flutes colliding, linen dresses feigning ease, rehearsed laughter caught in perfect boomerangs. I'd seen it all before, the curated fragments of people who believed performance was truth. None of it touched me, not really until it did. The caption appeared between frames, stark black letters stamped across soft white, family tradition loading. 3 words harmless to strangers, but to me they cut sharp, swift, unforgiving. My heart stumbled once, not from surprise, but from recognition. There it was, the ritual that was supposed to hold me now loading without me. They hadn't just continued. They had announced it, made it spectacle, pressed it into permanence for strangers to watch, while I sat in my kitchen, erased in real time. I stared at the words until the screen blurred, until my own reflection wavered beneath them. The coffee beside me cooled unnoticed, the steam thinning into nothing. What had been comfort only moments ago turned hollow. The mug felt heavier, its warmth unable to travel into my hands. The sunlight, once golden, shifted to something too pale, too stark, exposing what I could no longer deny. Even the clock's ticking seemed louder, sharper, cutting each second into smaller pieces of a truth I hadn't wanted to face. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an oversight. Captions don't type themselves. Posts don't arrange their own timing. Someone had chosen those words, pressed publish, and in doing so declared me absent. My silence wasn't accidental. It was curated. They turned my absence into their performance, my erasure into their legacy. My pulse slowed, heavy but steady, as the truth settled into place. My absence wasn't silence. It was spectacle. It was another scene in a story they were desperate to sell, written across the screen of my phone for strangers to applaud. And the coffee beside me, cooling forgotten, became another kind of evidence, a witness to how fast the morning had fractured. I set the phone down, face up, the caption still glowing like a wound. My fingers tightened around the mug, but the comfort was gone, replaced with the kind of awareness that shifts the air in a room. It wasn't just a caption. It wasn't decoration. It was a receipt, time-stamped, archived, undeniable. Have you ever seen one post that shattered your morning one caption, that reached across the quiet and rewrote the air around you? That was mine. Family tradition loading. And with those 3 words, the day split open. Nothing about it was ordinary anymore. Exhibit A, the email. It sat in my inbox with the quiet weight of a weapon disguised as nothing more than a line of text. No warning, no subject line, screaming danger, just another message among dozens waiting with the patience of something lethal. The kitchen was still wrapped in the blue glow of the screen. The steam from my coffee had already faded into air, leaving behind the bitter scent of something abandoned. The clock ticked above the sink, steady and different. My fingers hovered, then clicked. The page unfolded, and there it was, plain as bone. Cancellation confirmed. 2 words. Simple. Efficient. Almost polite. But they landed with the weight of steel. I read them once. Twice. Then allowed my own voice, breaking the stillness like a gavel striking wood. Cancellation. Confirmed. Each syllable hit the air with a clang that reverberated in my chest. They didn't bend or soften when spoken. They dropped into the room like iron, final, unarguable, colder than silence. And then came the line that ended every excuse, the detail no one could polish or disguise. Requester Celine Preston. I read it again, slower like testimony, like I was carving the truth into the walls of the room itself. Requested. By Celine Preston. Her full name, stark in black and white, not whispered, not implied, but stamped and delivered by the system itself. Typed by her own hand, sealed by her choice, carried to me with the indifference of code. There was no performance in it, no caption to spin a prettier story. An email doesn't gossip. An email doesn't lie. It records. I stared at the glow until her name etched itself behind my eyes, searing into my vision like an afterimage of fire. Cold, clinical, undeniable. My throat tightened, not from surprise, but from confirmation. Suspicions had lived in me for weeks, fragile, easy to dismiss when drowned by their laughter, their champagne, their curated loyalty, staged in the bright lights of family ritual. Suspicion is fragile. Evidence is not. This was different. This was time-stamped, archived, permanent, and still a part of me tried to resist to imagine a softer explanation. Maybe it was a glitch, a clerical error, a system hiccup. Maybe my name had slipped into the void by accident, not intent. But no, systems don't type her name letter by letter. Algorithms don't decide that Celine Preston should replace me. Only intent does. And intent had signed itself into existence one keystroke at a time. The silence of the room pressed harder against me. The refrigerator hummed like a nervous witness. The clock's tick grew too loud each second, marking the distance between who I had been before this message and who I was now. My fingers curled into the edge of the table, the wood biting into my skin, a reminder that I was still here. Still solid, even as the screen burned proof of my erasure into my eyes. Exhibit A was mine now. Evidence delivered not by allies or whispers, but by their own hand. It struck me then that erasure is never careless. It is sharp, deliberate, surgical, like a scalpel, carving away what they don't want visible. They had planned this, approved it, executed it. And in their arrogance, they had left the receipt in my inbox, certain I wouldn't find it or wouldn't dare to name it for what it was. But I did. And once you see a receipt, you cannot unsee it. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the laptop painting my face in blue. In the reflection of the glass, I looked unfamiliar. Harder, colder, stripped of illusions. They had tried to cut me out. But what they had handed me instead was proof. And proof doesn't vanish because someone refuses to acknowledge it. Proof survives. It waits. It sharpens. Exhibit A was not gossip. It was not a rumor tossed into the air like bait. It wasn't a story they could smooth over with a smile at dinner. It was evidence irrefutable, permanent as fingerprints smeared on a weapon, as permanent as a signature pressed in ink. Evidence they had given me themselves, signed and sealed in silence. And I knew it was only the beginning. So, I'll ask you, if you opened your inbox and saw your name erased, would you believe it was a mistake? Or would you see the intent carved into every letter? Comment. If you believe mistake. Comment. If you see intent. Exhibit B, the leak. It began as a tremor against the counter, the faint vibration of my phone sliding half an inch across the wood. At first, it felt like nothing like any ordinary buzz that arrives 100 times a day, but I knew before I even reached for it that this was different. I knew the way a storm announces itself in the air before a single drop falls. I picked it up and the screen lit the dim kitchen with a harsh white glow cutting across my face like an interrogation lamp. One name appeared at the top. Ivy. The cousin who always lived in the background, scribbling in notebooks, no one asked to see, perched at the edge of family tables with her quiet eyes that never seemed to close. She wasn't supposed to matter in this story, but now she did. The message unfolded like a blade. Don't worry, she's not coming. I handled it. I read it once, then again, and each time my eyes locked harder on the last line. I handled it. The syllables weren't careless. They were deliberate, clean, surgical. I whispered them out loud, my voice low, heavy, tasting the finality. Handled. Not forgotten. Not a glitch. Not an accident. Handled. Like I was a package to be misplaced, a stain, to be scrubbed, a loose thread, to be cut before anyone else noticed. Handled like my name wasn't carved into ownership, but penciled into a corner that could be erased with the swipe of a thumb. The pause after the word was louder than the word itself. I could almost hear the silence it created in the space between us, the kitchen folding in on itself while I held the phone. My coffee sat untouched beside me, cold now, the surface black, and still reflecting the glow of Ivy's message like a mirror warped by fire. My own face stared back at me, fragmented, blurred by the curved porcelain, a ghost of a woman watching herself be erased in real time. Handled. The word turned in my head until it lost its shape, became something more brutal than language. It wasn't just a status update, it was a confession. Not whispered by accident, but recorded by design. I imagined Ivy's fingers tapping out the letters, steady, certain, loyal to someone else. Loyal to Celine. Loyal to the performance. Loyal to erasure. The irony struck me so hard I almost laughed. She hadn't meant the message for me. It was meant to reassure Celine, to close the loop, to calm the performance backstage so the show could go on. Don't worry. She's not coming. I handled it. Those words were supposed to be invisible, kept behind the curtain, passed quietly like a stage cue. But the curtain slipped. The line delivered itself into my hands. And leaks, once they start, don't stop. They spread. They stain. Exhibit B proved what Exhibit A had already made plain. This wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't some faceless system tossing my name aside. This was orchestration, deliberate, layered, intentional. A plan built in whispers, passed through texts, sealed in actions, carried out without hesitation. And now I had the proof stamped onto my screen, time-marked, sender named. Not rumor. Not speculation. A receipt. I stared at the phone until the letters blurred. My thumb hovered above the screen, tempted to screenshot, tempted to forward, tempted to brand it into permanence. But I didn't need to. The image was already carved into me, burned into memory the way lightning sears itself into the eye long after the sky has gone dark again. I could close my eyes and still see it. Don't worry. She's not coming. I handled it. Handled. The word was poison dressed as reassurance. Ivy thought she was protecting Celine, but all she had done was confirm what I already knew. Erasure requires accomplices. Betrayal never happens alone. And now I had the receipt that proved it. I set the phone down face first, but the weight of it pressed into my palm long after. The silence in the kitchen shifted, no longer empty, but charged alive with the knowledge that their secret was mine now. Exhibit A was the match. Exhibit B was the gasoline. Together, they were building toward a fire too wide to contain. They thought they had handled me. They thought the performance was safe, the stage intact. But they forgot the simplest rule. Receipts always surface. And now their own accomplice had delivered mine. I wasn't packing for a trip. I was packing for trial. That was the sentence that circled in my head as I sat at the kitchen table, the lamplight buzzing faint above me, the night pressing against the window in silence. The others would be rolling silk into suitcases, lining up linen shirts and dresses, folding swimsuits into neat stacks. But not me. There were no clothes laid out on my bed, no jewelry, no perfume bottles waiting to be tucked into soft pouches. My room looked bare except for the low hum of the printer grinding on the desk, pushing out sheets of paper one after another like a machine designed to testify. The sound of it filled the apartment, steady, mechanical, heart-like in its rhythm. Each page slipped out and landed on the tray with a whisper, white edges stacked in growing weight. I sat forward, watching the black letters appear, the ink etching itself into permanence. Exhibit A. The email. Cancellation confirmed requester Celine Preston. The words no longer glowed on a screen vulnerable to deletion or denial. They lived now on paper, tactile, unchangeable, harder than stone. I slid the page into a neat pile, smoothed the edges flat with my palm, and felt the weight of their choices accumulate in my hand. Then came Exhibit B, the leak. Ivy's text delivered to me by mistake laid bare in black ink. Don't worry, she's not coming. I handled it. I printed it twice, once for the folder, once as backup, because evidence is fragile if it exists only once. My breath slowed as the sheet landed on the stack. I picked up a yellow highlighter and dragged it across the word, handled the neon flare slicing the page open. It glowed like a wound. Her loyalty shining not for me but against me, and now it was mine to preserve. One by one, I gathered the papers, each receipt transformed into artifact. The email, the text, the timestamp, the sender. They lay before me in rows like a gallery of betrayal. My pen scratched quick notes in the margins. Page numbers, context, the kind of small details you think a lawyer might ask for if this ever made it to court. I wasn't dressing for travel. I was dressing the truth in paper. Every detail mattered. Every mark was a stitch in the record that would hold even when words failed. I reached for the manila folder, its cardboard spine creaking faintly as it opened. Inside, I clipped the first set of pages, the metal teeth punching down to lock them in place. The click rang sharp, satisfying a sound like a gavel striking wood. I slid in the next set, then the next until the folder grew thick in my hands. I pressed the flap closed, tucked it under, and felt the weight of it settle. Not sunscreen, not linen, not sandals or silk. Just receipts, heavy, undeniable, layered into a case that was building itself whether I wanted it to or not. I leaned back for a moment and looked around the room. My suitcase sat empty on the floor, its zipper gaping like a mouth waiting to be fed. But I had nothing to give it. No fabric, no color, no softness, only evidence. The irony almost made me laugh. They had tried to erase me from a trip, from a list, from a seat at their table, and here I was preparing not to travel but to testify. Not to join but to confront. The highlighter lay open beside me, its tip glowing faint yellow under the lamplight. I picked it up again and dragged it once more across Celine's name, the ink bleeding over her letters until they blazed like fire. Celine Preston. No way to deny it. No way to bury it. Her name was preserved now in a shade too bright to fade, sealed into the record she had created with her own hand. I closed the folder and held it to my chest, feeling its weight against me like armor. This wasn't luggage. This wasn't preparation for leisure. This was an arsenal. Every receipt was a weapon. Every page was a shield. They thought erasure was silence, that my absence would be invisible, but paper speaks louder. Ink testifies. The printer fell quiet at last, the room sinking into stillness. Only the faint smell of toner hung in the air, sharp and chemical, the scent of permanence. I stacked the leftover paper, neatly clicked the highlighter shut, and placed the folder in the center of the table. The light pooled across it, golden and heavy, as though the lamp understood what it was illuminating. I wasn't packing for a trip. I was packing for trial. And when the moment came, I would have everything I needed, not in clothes or jewels, but in receipts stacked and sealed, waiting to speak louder than any of them ever could. The dock stretched out in front of me like a trial by fire, every plank of wood groaning under the weight of my steps, every nail embedded like a judge's stare. The air smelled of brine and diesel, the perfume of a world that had been curated for others, but belonged down to its last signature to me. The yacht floated ahead, white and gleaming, polished within an inch of vanity, the kind of vessel meant to broadcast power, meant to whisper legacy with every shining rail. My hair whipped across my face as the wind rose sharp as a warning, but I kept walking. Each step sounded like testimony. Each heel striking the wood carried the rhythm of a verdict being announced. Behind the tinted windows of the deck, I could see them gathering blurred silhouettes framed in glass. Celine leaned too close to Victor Odessa's pearls, glimmered like a constellation trapped at her throat. Dorian stood stiff and tilted away from the sight of me as if by looking out to sea he could erase the inevitability walking toward him. They believed I was absent, that my silence had been secured, that their performance was intact. But receipts do not stay buried. They walk. They arrive. They board. The yacht loomed taller as I approached its hull, slicing through the waves with smug indifference. The dock creaked beneath my weight, the tide slapping against wood in steady applause. And then I saw her Maris Calder, the crew leader, stepping forward in her pressed uniform, her face unreadable years of neutrality etched into the calm line of her mouth. She was not family. She was not performance. She was procedure, and procedure doesn't lie. She stopped at the gangway, looked directly at me, and dipped her head the slightest fraction. Her voice was clear, deliberate, every syllable cut from stone. "Welcome aboard." She said, the pause stretching the silence behind her thick with tension. Then her eyes steadied, her lips parted again, and the word dropped like a gavel. Welcome aboard. The owner. The pause after owner detonated the air. Silence collapsed behind me, sucked into itself, and then bursting apart like glass under pressure. The laughter from the upper deck broke mid-breath. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips bubbles, trembling in their crystal prisons. Celine's smile cracked brittle as porcelain fissures running down her mask as if her face itself had betrayed her. Odessa's hand shot to her pearls, fingers tightening until they creaked, each bead pressing into her skin like tiny witnesses refusing to scatter. Victor darted his eyes toward her, waiting for his cue, but she had none to give. Even he understood there was no script for this moment. Dorian, my husband, didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't move. He only turned his eyes further toward the horizon, away from me. Away from the truth. His silence collapsing into complicity. He thought that by refusing to react, he could remain untouched. But absence in a storm is its own admission. He knew it. I knew it. The deck itself seemed to know it. I placed my hand against the cool steel of the railing as I stepped onto the gangway, the yacht rising beneath me like a throne they had sworn I did not deserve. The wind swelled, rattling the flags, sending the sea frothing against the hull as though the ocean itself had chosen sides. Maris didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. The word hung in the air, glowing, unerasable. Owner. One word had undone them. Not influencer, not guest, not silent partner. Owner. They could erase my name from a list, but they could not erase it from a deed. Ownership doesn't vanish because someone curates a prettier picture, or because captions tell strangers to believe in a legacy written by lies. It isn't negotiable. It doesn't yield to erasure. It stands carved into ledgers, sealed into signatures immutable as tide. I stepped fully onto the deck, the soles of my shoes striking against polished wood. The silence of the family behind the glass was louder than the ocean itself. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to wave my folder of receipts. The truth had spoken for me, uninvited and undeniable in the plainest way possible. They had tried to erase me, but in that single greeting, the performance shattered. Owner. The word echoed across the water, carried by the waves filling the void between us. Their toast fractured. Their ritual broke. Their legacy crumbled piece by curated piece. And I stood there in the center of it, not erased, not handled, not silenced but declared. Welcome aboard the owner. And with that, their story collapsed and mine began. The phone camera always told their side of the story. Celine held it high-angled, just so the golden light bouncing off her pearls, the bubbles in the champagne glass rising like curated proof of a legacy that had never been hers to own. Her voice glided across the deck, smooth, rehearsed, dripping with that blend of performance and entitlement she had perfected since childhood. Legacy. Loyalty. That's what family means on this deck. She said, her smile lacquered into place. Behind her, Odessa nodded like a monarch, blessing the words Victor, echoing her posture without thought, their movements stitched together into a tableau designed for strangers scrolling on their phones. The livestream chat flickered alive, hearts and emojis tumbling upward, audience members clapping through their screens at a performance polished until it gleamed. Celine thrived in that glow, her eyes darting to the numbers in the corner, her voice swelling as if followers equaled truth. She raised her glass toward the camera, whispering promises of bloodlines and loyalty, every word meant to cement her as the guardian of something sacred. But legacy isn't curated in captions. It's written in ledgers. And then it happened. A shadow moved across the frame. Maris Calder, the crew leader not trained for theatrics, not scripted for Seleni's show, walked calmly into view. She didn't glance at the phone, didn't sense the thousands of strangers watching, didn't bend her words to fit an illusion. She turned to me, dipped her head, and spoke the line that detonated the performance. Glad to have you aboard again, Ms. Wynne. She said, steady as stone. Her voice lingered, then sealed the truth. The owner. The silence that followed wasn't silence at all. It was rupture. The livestream feed caught everything, the champagne glass hovering midair. Celine's painted smile cracking at the edges, Odessa's hand freezing around her pearls. Victor leaned forward like he could physically shove the word back into Maris's mouth, but it was too late. The chat erupted before Selene could cut the stream. Wait. She's the owner. Why wasn't she tagged? Receipts don't lie. Comments spilled upward faster than bubbles, faster than Celine's trembling hands could hide. Her face hardened a frozen glitch in high definition. She fumbled tilting the phone downward, trying to redirect the frame toward champagne, toward fabric, toward anything but me. But truth doesn't shrink for the camera. It expands. And this time it was expanding in real-time, pixel-by-pixel broadcast to every stranger who had ever believed her narrative. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I stood within the shot, my posture quiet, my gaze unflinching, and the comments multiplied like a verdict being written by the crowd. She's been erased. They lied. This is proof. Each message struck harder than any gavel. Odessa looked at the phone as if it had become an executioner, her pearls clattering faintly against each other like teeth. Selene's voice died in her throat. The legacy she had tried to script dissolved in front of her audience, and there was nothing curated about it. The irony was sharp enough to taste. She had wanted applause. Instead, she got exposure. She had wanted followers to believe in loyalty. Instead, they saw betrayal unraveling, live, unedited, undeniable. Maris hadn't known she was walking into a broadcast. She hadn't meant to deliver Exhibit C's into the public record. But the best evidence never asks permission. It simply arrives. I kept still letting the storm of comments do the work. I could feel the phone capturing every flicker, every pearl, every twitch of Celine's trembling hand. This was not a folder tucked in a drawer, not a receipt sealed in a manila envelope. This was evidence shouted, typed, shared, multiplied by thousands of voices. A truth too big to bury. They curated loyalty. I curated evidence. And only one survives a live stream. If you were me, would you let the truth go public like this? Comment, one word or a waiver. They thought the night could be salvaged with champagne as though bubbles could patch over fractures already carved too deep. Selene rose first, her glass lifted high, catching the deck lights and fracturing them across the golden liquid until it glittered like stolen treasure. She thrived in these moments, her voice honed from years of rehearsing declarations as if the world were her stage. To family. To loyalty. To legacy, she intoned every syllable, smooth, deliberate, unwavering. Her gaze swept the circle like a searchlight, daring anyone to falter, daring anyone to contradict the performance. Odessa tilted her head with matriarchal approval, pearls resting heavy on her throat as if they alone could anchor her authority. Victor raised his own glass. Perfect echo trained to mirror her cadence without adding a single original note. Even Dorian's hand wavered uncertain, his fingers brushing the stem of an untouched flute caught between habit and hesitation. The ritual was meant to bind them. The toast a sealant meant to patch the cracks spreading through their carefully curated image. But rituals are only as strong as belief, and belief had already fractured. I hadn't come to raise glass. I had come to raise evidence. I let Selena's words die in the air, not bothering to interrupt her performance. Performances collapse better under their own weight. Instead, I reached into the folder before me, its manila edges softened by the heat of my hand, the spine already worn from the repetition of touch. I drew out the first sheet with deliberate calm, no flourish, no grand gesture. Just truth flattened against glossy wood under sterile light. The paper glowed faintly, its black letters sharp and cruel, each one an incision. I let it sit there, waiting, daring their eyes to drop. And they did. Silence thickened like fog, wrapping itself around the table, muting the clink of crystal before it could happen. I let the tension coil, then cut through it with a voice low, steady, exact. Exhibit C, Zoom transcript, word for word. The line stared back at them in print, merciless in its precision. She's not blood. She shouldn't own a family asset. Selene had whispered it once in the false safety of a muted screen, believing that distance could erase accountability. But ink has no mercy. Ink resurrects what performance tries to bury. The timestamp sat at the top, the words preserved her voice, converted into permanence. I pressed my hand flat on the page, pinning it like a specimen under glass. Not blood. I said quietly the words heavier than any raised glass. Not family. That was your toast before tonight. The air changed. Odessa's pearls clicked faintly, betraying the tremor in her fingers. Her chin-dipped eyes fixed on the table as though the wood itself had carved its own confession. Victor's throat bobbed, his smile twitching, collapsing under pressure it wasn't built to withstand. Celine froze mid-performance, her arms suspended her glass, trembling with unshed denial. Her smile cracked a fissure, spreading like lightning across porcelain. Champagne glittered untouched, mocking the fragility of ritual. And then I dealt the second blow. I reached again into the folder, pulling free a thicker sheet, heavier its weight, undeniable. I unfolded it with precision, laying it beside the transcript so that the two pieces of truth touched like aligned stars. The purchase agreement. Clean, sharp, irrefutable. My name etched across the bottom line in strokes of ink, steady enough to last longer than any caption. Exhibit D. I said, voice low controlled. Purchase agreement, signed, by me. The final word landed with the authority of a gavel. Signed. Not speculated. Not rehearsed. Not captioned. Signed in ink filed, sealed a truth beyond spin. My voice lingered on it, pressing each letter into their chests until they couldn't breathe around it. No one drank. Champagne trembled in crystal foam, sliding over rims and dripping silently onto the polished wood. Odessa's pearls rattled faintly, the sound brittle like bones knocking in a hidden closet. Victor avoided Celine's gaze, his echo chamber collapsing without a script to repeat. And Dorian? My husband looked smaller than I had ever seen him caught between the family that demanded his silence and the wife who now held the deed. His hand hovered uselessly near the glass, shrinking from both roles, no longer able to belong to either. Their toast was hollow champagne without conviction. My table was full of receipts, full of truth, full of ink that weighed more than their staged declarations ever could. Ink lasts longer than pearls, longer than hashtags, longer than champagne bubbles bursting in the night. Legacy isn't conjured in performance. It isn't spoken into being. It is written. It is filed. It is signed. The papers lay on the table like a quiet fire burning without flame, their presence louder than Celine's most polished performance. I let the silence reign. I let the evidence breathe. And I let them feel what I had known all along: rituals don't bind. Receipts do. And receipts don't clink, they cut. Performances don't end with applause. They end with cracks. That was the only thought that moved through me as the echo of my words died in the air, leaving behind the wreckage of what had once been their perfect staging. The toast still hovered between us, champagne sweating in glasses that no one dared touch, and the papers I had laid down gleamed in the low light like blades. For one breathless moment, the deck was still. Then the unraveling began. It started small. A cough disguised as composure. The scrape of a wooden chair inching backward, legs dragging across the polished floor. Whispers slid through the air like water seeping under a door. They thought they were quiet, but every syllable carried soft ripples against the silence that had been forced into place only moments before. It was the sound of performance giving way of illusion, cracking open to show the brittle underside. Odessa was the first to falter. The matriarch who had built her throne on pearls and posture lowered her gaze, the necklace slipping forward, as though even it wanted to escape her throat. Her hand clutched the tablecloth, wrinkling the linen into trembling folds. For so long she had been the anchor, the one whose silence had always held the weight of judgment. But in that instant, her silence sagged. She didn't speak because she couldn't. The truth was carved into the wood beneath her as though the table itself remembered what she wanted to forget. Victor tried to step into the void to plaster the cracks with politeness. He forced a laugh, thin and papery, the kind of sound meant to stitch a wound closed without thread. Well, what a spirited evening, he stammered, his voice wobbling like glass set on the edge of a table. But no one joined in. His smile froze stiff at the corners, his lips twitching as though even his own body rejected the lie. A smile isn't a shield. It's a fracture line, a break that spreads the longer you try to hold it. And then there was Dorian, my husband. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't touch his glass. He just stared somewhere beyond me, beyond all of us. His eyes cast outward toward the sea as though the horizon could offer him an escape. But silence is never neutral. It's a choice. A vote. A signature without ink. And in that moment, his refusal to speak wrote itself louder than any words could have. I repeated it, steady, deliberate, pressing the truth into the cracks already spreading around us. Silence is the crack in the glass. The words hung heavy, vibrating through the space, and I knew they felt it as much as I did. The metaphor wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was the room itself trembling under the weight of what had been exposed. The glasses on the table rattled faintly. Champagne trembling as though even the bubbles understood they were part of a performance now broken. One glass tipped against another, the clink soft, fragile, echoing too loudly in the hush. Once glass cracks, it never holds the same weight again. You can polish it, display it, pretend it's whole, but it will always carry the line of its breaking. And that was what this family had become, a gallery of cracked glass. Odessa, with her lowered eyes, pearls, sliding silence, no longer regal, but fearful. Victor, with his frozen grin, a fissure widening down the middle. Dorian, with his absence, stretched into an answer he would never admit aloud. Celine, her glass still lifted, but shaking now, as if even the champagne refused to obey her staging. The cracks were spreading faster than they could cover them. Whispers thickened around the table chairs, edged farther back, the carefully curated image unraveling thread by thread. What had been a performance of loyalty and legacy was nothing more than a mosaic of fractures. And once fractures show, they never disappear. They only grow. I sat there still letting their silence and their failures echo back on themselves, feeling the weight of the moment settle into permanence. They had wanted spectacle. They got shattering. They had wanted applause. They got cracks. And no performance survives the sound of its own breaking. Justice is an apology. It's action. Those words rang in my chest, steady as a heartbeat, as I sat across from him in the sterile brightness of the glass-walled room. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, buzzing like a swarm of insects trapped between life and death. And the air was heavy with the staleness of decisions postponed too long. The table between us stretched like a battlefield, stripped bare of ornament. Nothing left but the evidence that mattered. No flowers, no food, no distractions, just the folder I had carried through storm and silence. It had grown heavier with every step, not because of the paper inside, but because of what those papers carried: betrayals cataloged in black ink timestamps that refused to fade names they thought could be erased but never were. The folder lay open now, its contents fanned out like a trial laid bare. At the center sat the purchase agreement, the deed to the very thing they had tried to claim as theirs. Beside it, a pen glinted under the sterile light, simple and small but heavier than any gavel. And between the two, the agreement and the pen, was the narrow strip of space where my husband had to choose. Not me, not Celine, not Odessa, not Victor. Him. For once, silence would not shield him. I leaned forward, my voice steady low, forged in the heat of every night I had spent at the printer feeding blank pages and pulling out receipts that grew sharper with each copy. This isn't speculation. This is an assumption. This is fact. Ink over absence. Signature over silence. Justice isn't apology. It's action. The air thickened. He gripped the pen tighter. His breaths came shallow, uneven, as though centuries of loyalty to performance pressed against his chest, crushing bone and marrow, demanding that he kneel once more to illusion. His hand trembled, hovered above the paper. For a long second, I thought he might retreat, collapse back into the familiar shadow he had built his life around. But then the pen touched down. The sound was small, but it split the room. The nib scraped across the fibers, dragging jagged strokes that formed his name. Each letter carved itself into permanence, the ink bleeding into paper like a seal, undeniable, unerasable. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't elegant. But it was complete. By the time his hand lifted, the decision had been written. Signature confirmed. Ownership undivided. On the other side of the glass, Celine flinched her manicured hand, clutching the doorframe as though she could claw back what had already been sealed. Odessa turned her face away, pearls slipping against each other with a faint rattle, like teeth chattering against inevitability. Victor swallowed hard. his throat jerking, his frozen smile fracturing into silence. And Dorian, my husband, sat hunched over the page, the pen slipping from his hand, drained as though signing his name had consumed every ounce of strength he had never used to speak. I closed the folder with deliberate finality, the cardboard snapping shut like a verdict delivered. The air shifted in that moment. There was no applause, no reconciliation, no soft embrace to sweeten the edges. There was only the truth heavier than gold sealed in ink. He hadn't offered repair. He hadn't offered loyalty or love. What he had given me was transfer. A line of ink heavier than any vow, any word. I gathered the folder, stacking the papers into perfect order, and stood. He didn't meet my eyes. He stared at the desk, hollowed by the weight of what he had finally done. His silence was thunder now, a storm louder than the scratch of pen on paper. But silence could no longer erase. It had been complicity absence dressed up as neutrality until the moment came when silence broke and action was demanded. And for once, he had spoken not with words, but with ink. Justice isn't apology, it's action. And the action was mine now to carry forward, to wield, to guard. The record was written. The record was sealed. If you believe silence from the ones you love is its own kind of betrayal, its own complicity, comment. If yes, if no. Morning came without ceremony. Pale light spilling across the horizon as though the night had rinsed itself clean and left only salt and silence behind. It was the kind of dawn that carried no urgency, no demand to perform, just a slow unveiling of color smudged across a restless sky. I sat at the small table by the window, the wood cool under my bare arms, the air still damp with ocean mist drifting through the cracks. My hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. No cream, no sugar, just bitter strength, steady in its simplicity. The surface steamed faintly, curling upward into the gray dawn, fragile tendrils dissolving into air, and I breathed it in as though it could etch permanence into me, the way ink had etched permanence onto paper. The house was quiet. Too quiet for anyone who had been taught that noise is proof of belonging. There were no glasses clinking, no laughter pitched a little too high to convince strangers of joy, no curated phrases about loyalty and legacy repeated like hymns in a chapel that had forgotten its God. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, and the rhythmic pull of the tide against the rocks outside. For so long, I had grown used to silence as accusation. Silence as complicity, silence as a verdict delivered without words. But this silence was different. This silence was mine. I carried the mug to the balcony and leaned against the railing, its steel still slick with night dew. My eyes swept the horizon, the sea blurred at its edges, fog clinging low and swallowing the line where sky and water should meet. The world looked unsteady, but I wasn't. I lifted the mug, the bitterness biting the back of my tongue, and felt the warmth slide through me like quiet armor. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't vindication. It was something steadier. Presence. Quiet, undeniable presence. I thought about them, each of them waking in their separate corners, each of them scrambling to salvage an image that had already collapsed. Celine would be drafting explanations, polishing captions until her words gleamed but never rang true, pressing her smile into shape for the camera even as her mask cracked. Odessa would clutch her pearls tighter, rehearsing ways to transform her silence into authority, even though fear had already seeped through the cracks. Victor would echo whatever line was handed to him, his smile rehearsed in the mirror until even he could no longer believe it belonged to him. And Dorian, my husband, he would sit alone staring at the page he had signed, understanding with every passing second that silence could never again pretend to be neutral. But me, I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to correct their narratives or drown their whispers with louder noise. I had my coffee, my C, my receipts. Power doesn't need applause. It doesn't need spectacle. It doesn't even need recognition. Power only needs to exist, to stand, to breathe. I thought back to the folders still stacked neatly on the table inside manila edges, sharp against the grain of the wood. They didn't need to be brandished again, not today. They didn't need to be paraded or waved like banners in a storm. Evidence doesn't vanish simply because it isn't on display. Evidence lives, evidence waits, evidence strengthens in its stillness. That was what I had become, not the erased name they believed they had scrubbed from the record, not the absence they tried to disguise as tradition. I was presence. I was permanence. Ink on deed. Signature sealed. Owner. The coffee cooled slowly in my hand, but I didn't rush. I let it lose its steam sip by sip, letting the bitterness deepen as the liquid grew darker and colder. There was no performance to maintain no seat to prove no list to beg for. The world outside could churn with their lies, with their captions, with their carefully staged images. But here in the quiet, the truth was enough. Every wave breaking against the shore was another reminder. Permanence doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It persists. The horizon stretched out in front of me, gray giving way to silver to the faintest trace of blue. Birds moved across the water in arcs, their wings slicing through the fog, their cries sharp but fleeting. The tide pulled in and out, patient, eternal, uninterested in anyone's performance. The sea didn't care who raised a glass last night, who whispered over toasts, who tried to erase a name from a list. The sea knew only constancy, and in its rhythm, I found my own. I finished the last sip, the bitter dregs settling heavy at the bottom of the cup. I set the empty mug down on the railing and let the morning hold me. No fireworks, no spectacle. No applause waiting on the other side of a camera lens. Just a horizon that couldn't erase itself, waves that refused to stop repeating their truth, and a silence that finally wholly belonged to me. Quiet power. And sometimes that is the loudest thing of all. The first Sunday after everything broke, I set the table myself. No decorators hovering with trays of curated fruit, no stylists fussing with flowers until every petal obeyed, no staged clinking of glassware to prove a loyalty that never existed. Just me, a linen cloth smoothed flat across the wood, the light pouring in like liquid gold through the open window, and the sharp grounding smell of coffee filling the air. The table was smaller than the yacht's endless banquet, humbler than the glass-walled rooms where Celine once curated loyalty with a camera in hand, but it was mine. And for the first time, the seats weren't chosen by bloodline or performance. They weren't inherited. They were chosen by spirit, by truth. I set out plates that didn't match their edges, chipped from years of use, but each one carried more honesty than all the crystal they had paraded as proof of legacy. I filled simple glasses with orange juice pulp catching in the morning sun, glowing warmer than any champagne they had ever raised in brittle toasts. The coffee machine hissed, steady and familiar, filling the kitchen with a sound that belonged to no performance but to life itself. I sliced bread still warm from the oven, and when crumbs scattered across the cloth, I left them. Nothing here needed to be hidden. Nothing needed to be perfect. When the knock came, it wasn't sharp or rehearsed. It was soft, tentative, almost like someone asking permission. I opened the door and Avery stood there. She clutched her notebook close to her chest, her posture unsure, her eyes darting like a bird waiting to be told it had flown into the wrong room. But she hadn't. I stepped aside and gave her space to walk in. She did slow and careful, her gaze sweeping the mismatched table, the empty chairs, waiting without expectation. She sat down lightly as though afraid the chair might collapse under her. Her eyes lingered on the chipped plates, on the plain linen cloth that carried no crest, no initials embroidered in gold thread. For a moment, she seemed smaller than she ever had under Selena's shadow. And then she spoke, her voice low but unshaken. I don't want to inherit their performance. I don't want their scripts. I want to build something of my own. But I don't know where to start. I poured her coffee, simple and dark, letting the steam curl between us like a bridge. I slid the mug toward her steady. Start here, I told her. Start with truth. Build something that doesn't need to erase anyone to exist. Her hands trembled around the mug, and for a moment her eyes glistened, but she didn't turn away. She nodded, pulled her notebook open, and set her pen against the page. What came out wasn't a caption or a performance. It wasn't words staged for an audience. It was raw plans, dreams, fragments of ideas laid down in ink, uncurated, unstaged. The scratch of her pen filled the room like music, more honest than any toast, louder than any glass raised in forced applause. The other chairs remained empty, but I knew they would fill. Not with family bound by surname, not with loyal echoes afraid to break a performance, but with people who valued honesty more than spectacle. Friends who had known their own kind of erasure. Neighbors who had never been given seats at anyone's table but deserved one here. Maybe even strangers who would bring truth instead of silence. The family table had cracked, splintered under the weight of its own lies. But from its shards, something sturdier was being built. A new table. My own table. I leaned back in my chair, the morning light pressing warm against my shoulders. Ivy bent over her notebook, her hand moving quick, her head tilted with a focus that carried no fear. She was young, but she was free in a way Celine never could be her voice, unbound from the legacy Celine tried to script. Watching her, I felt a steadiness spread through my chest, something firmer than triumph. This wasn't victory born from spectacle. It was renewal. The brunch laid between us wasn't grand. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. And as Ivy lifted her eyes from the page and smiled tentative but certain, I realized that power isn't only in deeds and receipts. It's also in choosing who sits at your table. In building inheritance, not from surnames, not from curated images, but from loyalty that doesn't need to be staged. A different legacy. One I had chosen, one I was finally proud to claim. I used to believe erasure was something quiet. Something that slipped in with soft hands tucked into the margins where no one would look closely enough to notice. I thought it was subtle, that it came disguised as oversight, as mistake, as the kind of accident you could explain away with a shrug. But I know better now. Erasure is not gentle. It is violent. It does not creep at carves. It takes what you've built, what you've poured yourself into, and it strips your name clean, leaving only a hollow space where you once stood. They thought they could erase me from the story of the yacht, from the guest list, from the rituals of champagne and toast, from the curated photographs and captions meant to rewrite the narrative. They thought if they cut me out, I would vanish. But ink remembers. Receipts remain. And presence has a way of returning louder than any lie. I stand here not with banners raised or victory paraded, not with applause or cheers or any performance of triumph. I stand with something heavier. I stand with truth, the kind that refuses to die even when every effort is made to bury it. They curated images of loyalty, but loyalty without acknowledgement is nothing more than costume, a hollow performance wrapped in pearls and hashtags. They spoke of legacy, but legacy without credit is theft. Every caption they posted, every whisper they rehearsed, every ritual toast they staged was designed to convince the world I had no claim. But here's the irony: every time they tried to erase me, the evidence only carved my name deeper, as if their denial were the chisel and my permanence the stone. So now I turn away from them and I turn to you. Because family stories aren't just mine. They're yours too. Written in the quiet betrayals you've endured, written in the mornings you've woken to find your place, taken your name absent, your work claimed by someone else's hand. You know that hollow weight, the chest tightening, when you see proof that you weren't overlooked, you weren't forgotten. You were erased. And erasure is never a slip. It's not an accident. It's not a misunderstanding. It is theft, sharpened and deliberate. Think about that moment. The caption that cut you sharper than any blade. The conversation that carried on without you, where your name should have been spoken but wasn't. The table where your seat was filled by someone who hadn't earned it. The sting doesn't fade, does it? It lingers. It lingers because what's taken isn't just space, it's identity. It's credit. It's the acknowledgement that you existed in the story you built. And when they erase that, they don't just take recognition. They take legacy. That's why I'm asking you now here, where silence can't hide the truth. Have you ever been erased from something you helped build, something you poured yourself into, something you thought was yours? Have you ever felt that hollow ache watching your place filled by someone else's performance while the evidence of your hand was pushed aside? 1 wow, if yes. 0 if no. And if your answer is yes, I want you to write it out in full. Write it so the erasure can't continue. Write it so the receipt stays. Comment. Legacy without credit is theft. Because that's the truth. That's the record they can never scrub clean. They can steal seats at tables. They can steal captions on posts. They can even steal silence, twisting it into complicity. but they cannot steal the record of what you've built if you refuse to let them. This isn't just about a family yacht or champagne flutes raised on a deck polished for performance. This is about something larger, something universal. It's about what belongs to you and the vigilance it takes to guard it when others try to erase it. So let it be said here, clearly, permanently. Legacy without credit is theft. Say it. Type it. Leave it stamped where no one can pretend it wasn't. Because sometimes the loudest justice doesn't happen in a courtroom or on a deed or in a headline. Sometimes the loudest justice is simply refusing to let silence become the last word. Have you ever been erased from the very thing you built? 1, if yes. 0, if no. And if your answer is yes, don't stop at a number. Leave it in words carved into the record we make together. Legacy without credit is theft. Because what they erase, we write back. And what we write back, they cannot erase again. They spent years teaching me that the only way to matter was to fight for a chair at their table. They made it seem as though belonging was something they alone could grant a fragile permission written in ink that could just as easily be erased. The seating chart became their weapon. The toast became their trial. The silence between them became their verdict. And for years, I believed them. For years, I bent myself into smaller and smaller shapes trying to fit into corners they never meant to hold me. I nodded through omissions. I smiled through erasure. I swallowed every absence as though it were the price of love, the cost of family. But erasure only lives when you surrender the pen. I see it now with the clarity of dawn after fog burns away. I was never meant to beg for a seat at their table. I was never meant to shrink myself until I disappeared just to be tolerated in their frame. The truth is, you don't need their table. You don't need their invitations. You don't need their curated stage. You can build your own. Solid, steady, carved out of truth, not pretense. And when you set that table, you choose who sits there. Not by surname, not by performance, not by curated loyalty polished for strangers to admire. You choose by spirit, by honesty, by the kind of loyalty that is lived, not staged. This story was never about revenge. Revenge is noisy. It demands an audience. It feeds on applause, on gasps, on spectacle. What I've built is something else entirely. I don't need performance. I don't need their eyes to watch me reclaim what was already mine. This isn't payback. This isn't vengeance. This is record keeping. Line by line, page by page, every receipt stacked into permanence until denial has no corners left to hide in. They erased me from a guest list. But the record shows the deed in my name. They curated captions to erase me. But the record shows timestamps and transcripts that prove otherwise. They raised their glasses and spoke of loyalty. But the record shows ink heavier than champagne foam signatures, more permanent than pearls. So, the file is complete now. Exhibit A. The email cancellation confirmed my name removed by Celine's hand. Exhibit B. The leak, I handled it, they said, like I was a problem, not a person. Exhibit C. The transcript. She's not blood. She shouldn't own a family asset. Exhibit D. The deed signed by me sealed in ink ownership undeniable. Then the live stream where the truth streamed raw across thousands of screens. The cracks in their performance, the silence heavier than words, the fractures that spread until the entire performance collapsed. Each piece layered together, unerasable. Each one preserved like stone in an archive they can't rewrite. Together, they tell the truth louder than I ever needed to shout. Together, they make plain what their rituals tried to disguise, that what they called loyalty was theater, that what they called legacy was theft, and that what they tried to erase became immortal the moment I documented it. They built illusions, I built evidence. They raised spectacles, I raised records. And records endure. I don't need their chairs. I don't need their rituals. I don't need their permission to exist. What I have is something quieter, something steadier, something heavier. I have a record that speaks for itself, a record that cannot be erased, cannot be staged over, cannot be spun into a caption. I have a table of my own making, built not on inheritance or illusion, but on truth, A table where seats are not given as favors, or weapons but earned by presence, by loyalty, by honesty. So here is where the story ends. Not in applause, not in spectacle, but in permanence. You don't need to beg for scraps from someone else's feast. You don't need to fold yourself until you disappear. You don't need to fight for a name written on their list. You can build your own table. And when you do, let every record you keep, every receipt you preserve, every truth you refuse to bury become the foundation that cannot be erased. This isn't revenge. This isn't triumph staged for strangers to watch. This is record keeping. And the record is complete. And once the record is complete, no one, not Celine, not Odessa, not Victor, not even Dorian, can erase it again.